I don't see how, if you input the software of Islam into the hardware of Christian Britain, you get the same civilization at the end of it. After October the 7th, 3/4 of British-born Muslims, or Muslims living in Britain, did not believe Hamas committed murder and rape on October the 7th. Israel has stopped sharing intelligence with the UK government because there are so many jihadist activists embedded in the Home Office and in the intelligence agencies thanks to DEI legislation.
We, Labour, believe diversity is a strength, it's not a weakness.
Democracy only really works in a high-trust, homogenous, culturally coherent civilization.
What happens, though, if this sort of divergent path that young men and women seem to be taking at the moment doesn't somehow self-correct?
It turns out when your sales pitch to young women is hate men, work for a soulless corporation all of your life, have an abortion at 9 months, and then support men breaking into your locker rooms, sports, and your bathrooms, not a very convincing argument. And so if men and women don't couple up, don't have lasting marriages, don't have children they raise to be grateful inheritors of our great civilization, then our civilization will disappear. In every election, when they have voted against migration, we have been punished with higher levels of migration instead.
What did you mean by remigration? And what would you say to those who'd say that's racist, it's inhumane, it's illiberal?
Well,
Connor, thanks so very much for giving us your time.
it's a pleasure, John.
Can we begin? I'm always intrigued by Konstantin Kissin's insights. He's a very clever guy. He said that he's British in his own particular way, but added that being an ethnic Russian, he cannot therefore be English. What's he on about? Can't you be English if you share English values?
Well, I would ask, what are English values, John, given Henry VIII probably doesn't share a hell of a lot of English values with me, a Catholic, and he also wasn't a big fan of democracy or tolerance, for example. British values are an invention of the Department of Education in 2014, and they were put on a hand, and they said they are like democracy, respect for other faiths, free speech, the rule of law, many of which have also been violated by the current Labour government, as you can see, but Keir Starmer nevertheless continues to be English. What this is a category error, I think. A lot of, in the age of liberal tolerance, which is quite unique to the Anglosphere, as Anglophiles here, this sort of second nature to us, people feel a bit icky about saying that someone of a different ethnic background, different parentage, even different faith, cannot be English, Scottish, Welsh, or Northern Irish. They might be British by legal designation, British being an identity that was created to encompass the sons and daughters of empire, especially after the empire disbanded, and then the 1948 British Nationality Act was introduced to allow the sons and daughters of empire to visit the motherland again and even vote in our elections, which, is questionable. But that has somehow overridden, as a kind of civic identity, a values-based identity, the settled ethnic identities which are derived from families, chains of families that you can document centuries back because of Britain's exceptional record keeping that comprise the ethnic identities of these islands. And so what Konstantin is saying is he is descended from Ukrainian, Jewish and Russian parents, and that is his ethnic makeup, but he has been living in Britain for decades now. His son is born in Britain. He has deep ties to this place. He reveres its culture, its faith, even though I keep nudging him to be an actual Christian rather than just a cultural Christian. And so he considers himself a British patriot, even though he and many other people who would fit into this category are not themselves ethnically English. Now, that is not a moral judgment on them. I might consider them my countrymen or my kin, but much like the what is a woman question, one cannot just self-identify into a heritage. It's just a matter of categorization and parentage. And saying someone is not English, Scottish, Welsh, or Irish by parentage is not a moral judgment on them. However, the other side, the people that would like to pry open our borders and say that literally anyone from anywhere can be as British or Australian or as American as you and me, despite what values or what parentage they hold, are trying to make it a moral category because they would say if you recognize differences between people, you are actually creating inequality. And inequality, as we know, is the moral nadir of the present ruling political order. So what I think Constantine is saying is, let's not be totally absurd and deny reality exists. Let's not deny that people's parentage or their ethnicity or their nationality exists, rooted in something concrete, while at the same time saying, yes, there is a distinct culture, distinct religion, distinct national identity that both the grateful and friendly imported minorities and sons and daughters of immigrants that do come here and do actually marry into our tribe and participate by that culture can belong to, despite not themselves being ethnically indigenous to these places.
Well, as you've mentioned, there's been a great change in the way in which the British people themselves have accepted people from other parts of the world since decolonisation, and that has been at times contentious. In more recent times, you had a drop-off in contention. Now it's become a white-hot issue. The British approach to immigration seems to have been take people from anywhere in the world, no matter the culture, as long as they adopt British values, which sounds enlightened and reasonable, but it's not sitting well at the moment. How do you personally unpack this the questions around immigration at the moment in Great Britain?
So I think that much like questions about economics were the most salient issue of the time in Margaret Thatcher's generation, when our baby boomer predecessors were just getting into politics and duking it out with the apologists for Soviet communism during the Cold War. Matt Goodwin's written about this very well for Policy Exchange recently. For a generation that has grown up, especially since 1997, that's the sort of advent of Generation Z. I was born in 1998. Ever since Tony Blair revolutionized the country with his immigration and constitutional reforms, they have known no other world except the culturally and ethnically heterogeneous, multicultural Britain. And so questions of immigration, identity, ethnicity, and belonging are just as present and salient to them as questions of economics were to their predecessors. And there is cause for pessimism here, I must say. So in the last few years, ever since Brexit was achieved, despite the overwhelming majority of people who voted leave having immigration and decreasing it or outright stopping it been their number one issue, despite 90% of constituencies when polled in Britain wanting lower levels of migration, despite an overwhelming level of support for returning many people who have not integrated, who impose undue costs on the taxpayer, who commit completely preventable crimes, many people wanting them to return home. In every election, when they have voted against migration, we have been punished with higher levels of migration instead. And especially since Boris Johnson won in 2019, we have received total migration of over 1 million every year for the last 4 or 5 years. We have taken in predominantly from the third world, non-European migrants, well over 4 million people. And that's not even counting the over 150 to 180,000 illegal migrants who have crossed by small boats over the English Channel and smuggling themselves aboard lorries since 2018. So we have had a complete demographic, cultural, and economic revolution in the last few years. And it's very present, not just in the number of crimes that have been committed, not just in the 14.4 billion minimum spent on illegal migration out of the foreign aid budget every single year, but just in the aesthetic changes, the world on your doorstep feeling unfamiliar, the strange adverts being shown on the tube now, the number of people with different civic sense to the British and the Western Europeans who will, just blare music aloud on the bus or shout into their speakerphone, and just creates a slightly unpleasant country. And the reason for pessimism here is not just because of the grit thrown in the engine of state when anyone like Katie Lamb or Robert Jenrick or Rupert Lowe suggests maybe these people who have come here in the last few years who aren't contributing culturally or economically to our country, who were brought in, frankly, under false pretenses against the wishes of the electorate, could return to their homes with relatively little upheaval, but also because there have been people who have been settled in Britain for generations who do not consider themselves British in the civic sense of identity that the likes of Constantine Kissin does, or my friend Ian Hersey Ali would, as a custodian of British culture despite not being born in that land. Instead, they see themselves as having ethnic and religious interests that are hostile to and incompatible to the host majority. The worst example of this is, John, after October the 7th, the Henry Jackson Society and JL Partners polling did some polls to find out British-born Muslims' attitudes to Jews, the October the 7th massacre, and whether or not they should have sectarian politics in their country. And they found that 3/4 of British-born Muslims, or Muslims living in Britain, did not believe Hamas committed murder and rape on October the 7th. So they just believed that Hamas did absolutely nothing wrong on that atrocious day. 52% wanted to criminalize depictions of their prophet Muhammad, and a third wanted Sharia law to supersede common law and obviously human rights law, the sort of rat's nest of various competing legal doctrines that had been set up since the Second World War. And they wanted Islam to be the official state religion of Britain. I think the Church of England might be joining that in that project at the moment. But that is most concentrated among second-generation, British-born, university-educated Muslims aged 18 to 30. So those who have integrated, apparently, according to the most number of interactions they've had with the British state that extols British values in the version that was set forth in 2014, they are the least integrated and the most hostile. And this actually played out on video in the last week, where the remnants of the UK Independence Party, the party that Nigel Farage led and then left like he basically, farted in the lift and let the door shut behind him quite a few years ago, marched through an area called Whitechapel, which is notorious in East London for having the largest mosque in Britain, having its tube signs written in Bengali, having its tube barriers advertising giving to Islamic Relief, a charity that's been linked to the Muslim Brotherhood and banned by the United Emiratis as well. What happens is UKIP march through and declare that, this is their country and they would like to send back unassimilable foreign nationals, and out to meet them are legions of balaclava-clad Muslim men chanting Allahu Akbar. And when a group of pro-migration, stand-up to racism, Socialist Worker Party leftists with their pre-printed placards come out and say, there's no need for that, lads, this isn't helping, chanting Allahu Akbar, we're on the same side, a couple of the Muslim chaps turn around and go, no, we're not. And so what we're seeing is sectarian politics establish themselves in Britain's major towns and cities, even among the second-generation British-born sons and daughters of immigrants who are meant to be the most likely to have integrated. So it gives you a lot of cause of pessimism when, if we have bent our identity out of shape to encompass newcomers, and they have been here for decades, and they still have open, revolutionary, racial and religious antagonisms with the host population who have been so welcoming. So yeah, it gives me a lot of cause for pessimism, frankly, about the way immigration is going in my country.
It's only anecdotal, I know, but I was in London in January of this year, and in an Uber, I fell into conversation with the very nice driver who was a Pakistani. And I asked him whether he was Muslim. He said yes. I said, do you take your faith seriously? He said, no, I do not go to prayers, and neither does my wife. But, he said, we have 4 children, and they go to the Muslim school, and they know right from wrong, and they are absolutely committed. It's an interesting reflection on the way in which younger people are starting to take faith seriously, for better or for worse. And in this case, one assumes they may very well, those young people, become increasingly antagonistic to democracy itself. I mean, many of these people are really, their essential creed is more, I think, theocratic than it is democratic.
So Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Ed Hussein, both immigrants to, or Ed Hussein is the son of immigrants to the West, and who are either ex-Muslims or reformed jihadists in Ed's case, have written about this extensively. They've got some really alarming stuff in the book Heretics and then Among the Mosques. Ayaan called this practice cocooning, where otherwise less doctrinaire Muslims from various countries, first-generation immigrants, will come over to the West for mercantile economic reasons, seeking a better life, as we might say, and will settle and will pay their taxes and obey the law. Of course, we know that immigrants from that part of the world usually aren't net taxpayer contributors, according to data from Denmark and the Netherlands. They're usually a net cost to the state, but unfortunately, by the by. But what happens is, in contrast to the Western materialistic liberal society that is around them, that presents them with opportunities for temptation, according to the Islamic faith, they would call this fitna, and the entire purpose of the internal spiritual struggle is to reject temptation and lead a morally pure life. They end up insulating themselves in sectarian, ethnic and religious enclaves. They disengage from state courts and the state school system, and they essentially double down on doctrinaire Islamic practices in the Salafist school of Islam, which is living as closely as you can according to the 7th century life led by the Prophet Muhammad as the perfect man practicing the final revelation. And so that's why you see an increased use of things like the niqab or the burqa in certain areas like Whitechapel. This is why you see rates of honor-based violence and female genital mutilation skyrocketing in British cities, even though it isn't present in countries like Saudi Arabia and the Emiratis, who have cracked down on that sort of thing because they want to liberalize and commercialize and open themselves up to the world. And then when Ed Hussein toured the mosques in Britain, he found two alarming things. He went to Manchester in one case and spoke to a member of Manchester City Council there who himself was a Muslim, and he was saying that the mosques are being dominated by first and second generation refugees, people like the Abedi brothers, who committed the atrocious Manchester Arena bombing in 2017, who had, as teenagers, had fought Colonel Gaddafi as a group of jihadists in Libya. That their family had only fled Libya because they had an internal dispute with the Gaddafi regime. They weren't the best, considering they spent their housing benefit money on the nail bomb that killed and maimed many people in Manchester. And there are lots of these sons and first generation refugees from Libya, Syria, Palestine, even Pakistan, Iraq, who are radicalizing the other members of the congregation because they have seen war, they have seen conflict, and so it is second nature to them to wage jihad in the way that the Quran would say, being mujahideen, being physical fighters, distrusting and even in some cases killing non-believers, Christians and Jews. And the other alarming thing was Ed spoke to a imam in Bradford who has been upheld as a ambassador of integration, as the acceptable face of British Islam, and he had received plenty of criticism from the broader Muslim community saying you're basically a government stooge. And Ed had spoken to him, and this Muslim ambassador refused to preach against the atrocious grooming Pakistani rape gang scandal in his mosque because he said, well, this is the fault of the white girls for drinking and for dressing immodestly because that is not according to Muslim law. And when pressed, he had said by Ed, who had said, well, if you don't engage with the state, if you don't engage with the British public and make amends on these particular issues, aren't they going to become more hostile to Islam and demand you leave? And he said, well, see it from my position. The younger members of my congregation come to me and they say, Imam, when is the caliphate coming? And I tell them, well, just bide your time, study your scripture, get jobs that are important in the offices of state, and eventually patiently wait and the caliphate will come. So it gives you cause for pessimism when even the non-violent, apparently acceptable, integrated, government-sponsored imams are telling their fellow Muslims, themselves more moderate, like Ed Hussein, that eventually, if we just patiently wait, there will be a revolutionary theocratic overthrow of the Christian parliamentary democracy of Britain to establish a 7th century caliphate. So I frankly, John, I know people want to split hairs between Islam and Islamists. They want to say that there's a peaceful, law-abiding majority and just a fringe minority of radicals. I don't see how if you input the software of Islam into the hardware of Christian Britain, you get the same civilization at the end of it. And yet again, gives me a lot of cause for pessimism.
You talk about the hardware of Christianity in Britain. It's not hardware anymore. Isn't that part of the problem, that in fact we have been complicit right across the West in assisting those who are hostile to the things we believe in because we don't believe in those things we're supposed to believe in anymore. We've created a vacuum in our comfort and in our ease, and we lack conviction. We lack even the language to talk about our values, and values are in the end always driven by beliefs.
I think also values are driven by family structure, and this is why I would say it's still hardware to an extent, because Alan McFarlane's Origins of English Individualism is a really good book on this, by the way. We underestimate just how encoded in our habits, in our family formation, our values and beliefs are. So all the way back to the Middle Ages, Britain had very low levels of child marriage. It had almost non-existent levels of cousin marriage, especially among the general population, because it was prohibited by the first Archbishop of Canterbury and then ratified by the Catholic Church in the 13th century. And the law was only repealed because Henry VIII broke from the Catholic Church, because I think it was Anne Boleyn, who was the cousin of Catherine of Aragon, and obviously wanted to divorce his first wife and marry his second. But even though the law was lifted, it was never common practice among the general population. So what you got was marriage between families, siblings, breaking off and establishing new farm leaseholdings across the country. And so you had an internally migratory population with very low levels of familial intermarriage. And this was the foundation for the nuclear family, and then individualism, and then liberalism. So this is why the English think of ourselves as individualistic, think of ourselves as liberal. Why when we meet someone of a different ethnicity or even background, like your Uber driver, John, or the Catholic Nigerian priest that leads my congregation, or Christian Indians that I've met before, we sort of take people as we meet them, and we can kind of get along with them. Whereas in other parts of the world, the family, the clan, the religion, or in Islam's case, the Ummah, carries a lot more weight. Morality is only extended to those with whom you have a common identity. It's not universal. And so, whereas we think universally, the rest of the world does not. And so this is why it's allowed us to think ourselves into believing the rest of the world acts and thinks exactly like us. There are just these arbitrary geographical, economic, and cultural differences that stand in the way that could be easily repealed. And this is why what you're seeing now, I think, and better writers than me have written about this, Patrick Deneen, Yoram Hazony, and the like, is a contest between the Christian worldview that built the West and liberalism. Liberalism proper, by the way, not an aberration of liberalism, not liberalism having gone too far, but liberalism at its root. Because what liberalism in the Lockean and Rousseauian view believed is that all human beings are blank slates, that fundamentally, before civilization was rationally organized according to a social contract, before the first man committed the sin of picking up a rock and saying, "This is mine," and introduced into inequality into the world with private property, all human beings were walking around a Garden of Eden in a state of perfect freedom and perfect equality. And it's only since the creation of civilization that we are not equal. This is why you hear left-wingers whose paramount virtue is equality say that you are a threat to democracy if you are a populist, because populists are noticing differences between groups of people. They are putting one group's interests above the other, and so they are against equality and therefore against democracy. Because if you were for democracy and you believe that everyone is a blank slate, everyone would just be voting for the same thing anyway because it's all in our rational self-interest. This is completely contrasted to the Christian view of the West, where it says that, yes, all human beings have inviolable dignity if they are innocent, because we are made in the image of God. We are all universally capable of moral dignity, and what matters is not the fact that you have this egalitarian nature, but it's actually your individual acts of virtue that liberal proceduralism can't just throw away and outsource to international laws or neutral institutions. And it recognizes that per the Tower of Babel, per the Acts of the Apostles, God made people in different fashions. We have different cultures. We have different preferences. We were scattered across the globe and act in different ways, and we all have different paths of coming to objective truth. And it seems that the Christian West, given its peace and prosperity compared to the rest of the world, had that path to truth in the least amount of zigzags, let's put it that way. And I think what's happening now is, in retaliation to that totalitarian liberalism that demands that you can't have a preference for your people, your nation, your history, your identity, and demands that you apply a culture-blind practice to immigration, which then ends up importing third world tribalism and destroys liberalism and all the givens upon which it rests. You're seeing a lot of young men, like me, like the young men that voted for Donald Trump, frankly, like some of the Aussies that I met when I came over for CPAC last month, who are reverting not just to tradition, who are not just celebrating their national identity, but are actually returning to church. And that's why at Easter, 40% of the catechumens in both France and Britain, those joining the Catholic Church, being baptized for the first time, were young men under the age of 30. Catholics are now outnumbering Anglicans, who have become that sort of quietist, self-effacing liberal Christianity that you pointed out, John. They're outnumbering them 2-1, and that's not just due to the famous Catholic birth rate. I think what's happening is you're seeing, in contrast to the virulent, violent, often tribalism of imported communities in Britain and across the West, and in response to the supposedly value-neutral liberalism that instead makes our history, heritage, and young, ambitious, straight white men public enemy number one of wokeness, you're seeing a rejuvenation of consciousness in Christianity, in national identity, in faith, community, and country. And I think that's the only way we get out of this.
There does seem to be quite a bit of evidence that young men in the Anglosphere are turning back to faith. I understand this is happening in America as well, more so than young women.
Yes, I think what's happening, and the reason that they're doing that as well, they're going to the more, let's say, theologically robust or aesthetically traditional churches, is because the dividing line between left and right, and going back to the previous paradigm of economics, it used to be capitalism v socialism, but the dividing line between left and right, all the way back to the French Revolution, was hierarchy versus equality. And what the church, at least as an institution, is supposed to preach. I know as a Catholic, I have my contentions with the Pope now and then, the last couple especially. But what the church does present and preaches is hierarchy. It presents a orientation towards what is beautiful, what is good, what is true. It commands you to make sacrifices, take on responsibilities, be a pillar of your community. It essentially says the same message that Jordan Peterson put out when he first came on the scene and became a surrogate father to many lost and directionless young men, which is pick up the heaviest burden that you can carry and carry it so that someone who is relying on you doesn't have to shoulder that burden instead. And that is very meaningful to men who are otherwise offered the option of sit at home, run in place in a dead-end career job in a country that's completely financed by debt, and just simply outsource all of your desires for achievement and lasting relationships to porn and video games. Have nothing but surrogate activities and don't cause the social revolutionaries wrecking your society any particular trouble. And so this is why lots of young men are going back to church, to find a place in a community, to find a sense of spiritual nourishment, intellectual nourishment as well. Don't forget, like me, lots of young men came to the church through politics because Jordan Peterson engaged in the culture wars, then did his biblical lectures, and then said something that resonated with them, and they followed that rabbit hole down to actually practicing the faith and submitting their doubts in humility to the wisdom of tradition. And also lots of young men, don't underestimate it, are looking for a good woman to have a life with, to make a wife and have children with. Because one of the saddest things that's happened over the last few years, John, is the number of young men that I've interacted with in my audience or have seen my interviews who have just said they've given up hope. Because about a third of young men aged 18 to 30 in the US, in the UK, have never had a relationship. And that is an unprecedented level before. Now, perhaps it's just the internet allowing us to hear from these listless young men. Perhaps in the past we had an excess of young men who either would have joined the priesthood or had their names emblazoned on a war memorial because they died gallantly fighting for their country. But in the absence of both religious vocations and mass conflict, we've now got lots of young men who are wandering around with not very much productive to do and very few relationship prospects. And especially because the well has been poisoned by misandric feminism over the last few years, not least of all Me Too, but also the sort of Gloria Steinem sentiment that women need a man like a fish needs a bicycle. There has been antagonisms engendered between the sexes. And so what they want to do is they want to return to a place that, yes, provides them meaning and structure and tradition and beauty and standards, but also in the hopes that they find a woman who hasn't been taken in by a self-destructive, man-hating ideology that's been put out there for the last few years, and so they might be able to have a little platoon of their own to act as a custodian of their culture and give them a reason to get up in the morning, go to work, make sacrifices, earn some money, and come home and support that household. All of these things are noble endeavors, and I think that's actually why, of the young men that I've met that have been in politics, John, they have been of much greater moral character than a lot of people that have been leading our countries for the last few years. I won't name any names, but at one point during the previous Conservative Party administration, there were a lot of scandals coming out about people living debaucherous lifestyles and maybe drinking and taking some illicit substances that they shouldn't have. And I must say, in my cohort of young men that I surround myself in the water I swim in Westminster, some have given up drinking entirely. None have touched drugs. They're either engaged or married. They're very well read. And because they don't have that internal moral compromise, because they've cultivated virtue, because they have a sense of morality that is outside the immediate gratification or pursuit of power, they are on mission. And I would trust them much more with the officers of state than the predecessors that have put us in this mess. So I see this trend as very encouraging.
Can we just, staying with this for a moment, I'm interested, very interested in what you have to say, and certainly accords with my own observations and the number of younger people who pull me up for conversations because they've listened in to a guest that I've had or whatever have you. And I'm very struck by how aware many of them are, how well informed they are, how much they know about what's going on, how worried they are about our culture. This is in Australia. But it seems, it's very much an Anglosphere thing, as we've just touched on. But what does it say if men, having been told, well, you're toxic just because you're male and DEI will be loaded against you, the US military recruitment has recovered because they banned DEI. It turned out that young American men were saying, well, if I sign up and I do something courageous and brave, I won't be recognised for it. Somebody who ticks a box will be recognised. It's not just, it's not fair. As soon as it was removed, there was a great recovery. They hadn't had a Jordan Peterson saying, pull your shoulders back. The answer to being called a terrible person is not to think that a therapy culture can solve your needs. It's to face up to who you are, find yourself, and then go back out and be noble in the world. They're all great messages, as you've just said. What happens, though, if this sort of divergent path that young men and women seem to be taking at the moment doesn't somehow self-correct and bring young people back together again philosophically and in terms of belief? Have you given that much thought?
I have, and a few things keep me up at night, but that's one of them. I will start with a note of optimism, which is rare for me because I am quite curmudgeonly, John. At the last election in America, there was a predicted 54-point gender gap, I think it was, in the New York Times, where women were swinging overwhelmingly for Kamala Harris, whereas there was a slight swing among young men from the Democrats under Joe Biden and the unprecedented electoral circumstances that were brought by the COVID-19 pandemic and lockdowns to Donald Trump, a sort of slight movement to the right. And this is the same sort of pattern that we're seeing, for example, in Germany in the last election, where young men voted, I think it was 4 points more than the average for the AfD, whereas women voted 25 points more than the average for the Communist Party, Die Linke. That didn't materialize. Instead, what you got was a narrowing of Democrat support among young women, because it turns out when your sales pitch to young women is hate men, work for a soulless corporation all of your life, have an abortion at 9 months, and then support men breaking into your locker rooms, your sports, and your bathrooms, not a very convincing argument to the majority of young women and women on the whole who actually don't have pathological relationships with their fathers, their brothers, and the men they love in their lives, and would, quite like the young men returning to church, just like to have a family and have a fulfilling personal life. So I think by the virtue of the right being virtuous, also less ugly. I know it's a very superficial point, but have you seen the lineups from these Antifa protest arrests? It looks like Arkham Asylum has been opened. Loads of them has nose rings and hair that looks like they've dyed it with the pigmentation of a toxic frog in the rainforest. Loads of them are fat and miserable and on various forms of psychoactive medicine. That's not a very attractive life to lead, and the majority of well-adjusted people actually want to be high-achieving and attractive and happy and achieve eudaimonia, sort of harmony in their life. That's why I remember at the inauguration, there was a party I went to. A photograph got posted on the front cover of New York Magazine. There was a transgender writer who called this the Cruel Kids Club and basically insinuated, well, these were the attractive, popular kids who bullied me in high school, and now they're winning in elections. And it's like, yeah, I'd rather be a part of that group than a part of your group, a sort of a resentful person living on the margins trying to tear down civilization. I think that sales pitch is a lot more attractive, and I think that will actually win people over. However, we are still seeing large stated values gaps in the UK, in Europe, in South Korea as well, according to John Murdoch's piece in the Financial Times. And if this does continue, what you're going to see is downward pressure on birth rates, yet again, which itself manufactures consent usually for mass migration, because people are treated, per the ideology of the blank slate that we mentioned, as fungible, interchangeable economic units who can just be dragged and dropped anywhere like balancing numbers on a spreadsheet. And so if men and women don't couple up, don't have lasting marriages, don't have children they raise to be grateful inheritors of our great civilization, then our civilization will disappear, either through demographic displacement driven by economic and demographic demand, or by a sort of quiet retreat into loneliness and surrogate activities like porn, social media, and video games. The only, again, encouraging signs that I'm seeing of this are that among Eric Kaufman and Paul Morland have done good work on this. Among religious minorities, particularly Catholics, the birth rate is up substantially compared to the general liberal population. You're seeing, again, a upward tick in the number of conservatives versus the number of self-identified liberals having children in America. Divorce rates are slightly down, significantly down among practicing Christians, like mass-going Christians, not just self-identifying, but I don't attend worship services Christians. And so as people get a lot more cognizant of their national, cultural, and Christian identity, I think that you're going to see a course correction, and I think you're going to get more potent custodians of our culture so that the next generation, Generation Alpha or Generation Beta, a terrible nickname that I'm sure they're going to change, are actually going to be a lot more salient of the issues they're presented with. And they need to be, given if things continue, they're going to inherit an even worse world than we're living in right now.
Connor, the appalling assassination of Charlie Kirk sent shockwaves right around the world, particularly amongst those young men that you're talking about who had tapped into him and agreed with what he was saying. It reflects unbelievably poorly on the zeitgeist that so many people wanted to dance on his grave. It tells you something about what some people call the left, what I would call the people who are increasingly dominated by emotion rather than calm reason and decency, because the debate has become so emotionalised. I think it was Ayaan Hirsi Ali, we are in danger of turning our democracy into an emocracy. And one of the questions that arises in my mind is, will those who are so offended by it and who are so spurred on and who are saying, right, well, actually I'm going to go back to church and I'm going to stand up for things and I'm going to try and be salt and light. And I greatly respect, for example, Dave Rubin, who was in Sydney last week, for saying that Charlie Kirk changed his life. He said all this publicly for the better, and that he wants to carry on Charlie's work, despite the fact that in many ways, they had different perspectives on certain matters, quite a few matters, I would think. But what I'm driving at here is there's a right way to respond and a wrong way to respond. And Erica Kirk made it very plain that forgiveness, turning the other cheek, responding to hatred with love, in the end is more powerful than joining forces and saying, well, you've declared war, so we'll declare war on you. How do we find the right balance there? And here's a subset of the question in a way. If young people are looking for leadership, who's going to inspire them on the horizon around the place at today? Who's going to set the model that they'll follow?
So I'll start in reverse order, if I may, John. As someone who only had the pleasure of meeting Charlie once when he came over for his Oxford and Cambridge Union debates, I fed him a few resources on how Britain is turning into a midpoint between a caliphate and a failed Soviet state that he then used in his GB News interview to talk about the plight of Lucy Connolly, who has now mercifully been let out of prison. But she was imprisoned for 31 months for an imprudent tweet during the Southport protests and riots last summer, whereas, in the city of Rotherham, the most notorious city for the Pakistani rape gangs, more people have been arrested for participating in the protests than they have as part of the rape gangs. Absolutely atrocious. Charlie used that in his interview and put leverage via the US government, the State Department, on the UK government.
Can I just, I hate interrupting my guests and my listeners don't like it either, but more protesters arrested than perpetrators of crimes in the grooming.
Yes, in Rotherham specifically. Yes.
It's pretty telling.
Yes, yeah, it is, and that's because multiple reasons. Number one, the fear of political correctness invoking the accusation of racism if you blame one community for disproportionately committing the crimes and covering them up than the other, but also because Labour has been historically reliant on Muslim voters as a client group to get them over the line, and they're now petrified of losing their seats of multiple cabinet ministers because Muslims are now voting for sectarian independent candidates with an organisation called the Muslim Vote, which was historically as well linked to a prescribed terror organisation called Hizb ut-Tahrir, and last election elected 4 independent Muslim candidates on an almost exclusively pro-Palestine ticket. So the reason they don't want to continue the inquiry into the grooming gangs, as has just been collapsed with multiple survivors resigning from the panel that's been appointed only in the last week, is because they don't want to lose even more of these voters. It's utterly craven. And Charlie Kirk was consistent in calling this out, by the way. He was very concerned about the Islamization of the West. And I say all of this to say there isn't currently a replacement, and I don't think he's replaceable. I think this is why lots of people like Jack Posobiec and John Doyle and Tim Pool and Ben Shapiro are pooling their efforts together, and why you're seeing Charlie's tour continue with the support of Megyn Kelly and Turning Point USA, but with a revolving cast of guests, because Charlie had a unique energy and a unique ability to be inviting and, yes, rhetorically sharp in responding to the vitriol on the absurdity launched at him by college campus leftists, but also to be compassionate. I mean, he would go on this odious podcast called Whatever, where a bunch of women who engage in online prostitution, frankly, selling their wares on OnlyFans, will go on and debate anti-feminists or red pill bros or influencers. And Charlie Kirk went on there and sat down, and he actually regaled them with the story of how he met Erica, how he wooed her despite her being an accomplished businesswoman and a beauty pageant queen. And he explained to them how she now has a very fulfilling life being a wife and a mother. And you just saw those women's hearts melt on the spot, because he wasn't being, he's being judgmental about their lifestyle choices, but he wasn't consigning them to hellfire for all eternity. He was presenting a positive alternative vision that if they followed Christ and they got their lives in order in the Jordan Peterson way, they might be able to live for themselves if they reformed. And that's the great thing about Charlie Kirk. He was inviting. I will, however, take umbrage with the people who say that we only need to relegate our response to mercy and compassion and discourse. Because I would say there are three groups here, John, that have revealed themselves in the aftermath of Charlie's murder. And Charlie did once tweet back in 2016, you can tell a lot about people by how they respond to somebody's death. There are the people who admired Charlie, who want to practice what he preached and who agreed with him. There are the people who didn't agree with him, but who admired him and admired his conduct, and who are amenable to resolving the disputes we have about policy matters with civil debate. One of these such people was actually the guy who was asking him the question when he was fatally shot, because he did a TikTok and he said, look, I didn't agree with Charlie on anything, but I am committed to civil discourse, to resolving our disputes, and I can't believe that someone who shares my politics did this, because allegedly Charlie Shooter was a leftist activist who couldn't stand his hate, who was turned in by his dad, and has a transgender furry boyfriend. So he's into all sorts of strange, politically charged, perverted subcultures. And the third group, John, is people who did not agree with Charlie, who would categorize Trump, Charlie, you and me as divisive, racist, the second incarnation of Adolf Hitler. And as we know, because Adolf Hitler in contemporary politics ever since the Second World War has become the secular version of Satan for pretty good reason, I would say. You are morally legitimate to shoot a Nazi, shoot a fascist. In fact, we have whole war memorials and memorial services dedicated to the people who laid down their lives to defeat that evil. So the implication when they call someone like Charlie Kirk or Donald Trump or you and me, a Nazi, a racist, and a fascist, is you're allowed to kill this person, we will praise you for it. And you cannot have a country with people who think the response to civil discourse is violence because they believe words are violence, because they believe that by speaking in the world, you create inequality, you create racism, you destroy democracy, etc. You can't have a country with people that think it's acceptable to respond to civil discussions with political assassination. And so, yes, I admire Erica Kirk's capacity to forgive her husband's murderer. I probably fall on the President Trump side of things, of where I'm a little bit more fallen than she is, and I find it incapable to forgive my enemies. But to extend unqualified mercy to the guilty is to endanger the innocent. And so what the Trump administration, what all of our respective governments now need to do, is crack down on the internationally sponsored leftist terror networks that make it impossible for conservatives to engage in civil discussion in our countries without significant security. We've been speaking about Ayaan Hirsi Ali, for example. Ayaan is a valiant defender of all of the values and even the Christian faith that we hold dear despite coming from another country. She is, I would say, the model of integration. She is quite literally married into our tribe. She has renounced her prior faith and adopted the Christianity that made the West great. She's dedicated her life to defending our civilization. She lives with 24/7 security and has done for the last 2 decades because our governments have consistently imported violent jihadists into our mix. The only way to keep our friends, our families, and our loved ones safe is to remove the people that do not need to be in our civilization, who are making it unsafe, or to incarcerate the people who equate words with violence and then act with violence in kind. And then the third thing to do is to socially shun the people who have celebrated and glorified this death without calling for violence. I have already seen in the week leading up to Halloween people wearing Charlie Kirk being murdered as a Halloween costume. Those people should be named, they should be shamed, and people should practice their rights to freedom of association and say, I do not want to employ this person, if they think that the appropriate response to someone being murdered for having a polite discussion is to be killed in front of his wife and children.
I understand exactly where you're coming from and what you're saying. Let's pursue it a little bit further. We need, if you like, to be active on a wide range of fronts. For example, you mentioned Ayaan Hirsi Ali. She's a living proof that it is completely dishonest and utterly misleading to conflate religion and race. That's a really important point. You can't say, well, it's racist to go after people who rape and destroy the lives of young white girls because they are actually, if you like, in fact, Muslim. There's a difference between belief and race. To conflate the two is part of the intellectual debate that we have to, I think, be very active in. But then you come to the reality we've got to use to the best of our ability what our forefathers have given us, the democratic process, to try and ensure that the law, for example, is upheld, that justice is pursued, that educational facilities actually teach our history properly. We need to be active on many, many fronts. To take that political aspect of this, I understand that the Islamic vote or the Muslim vote in Britain now controls around 25 seats in the House of Commons. By the mid-2030s, it could be as high as 45 or so. That really, in a tightly numbered parliament, opens unbelievable opportunities for using the democratic process for ends such as introducing Sharia law.
Yeah. Basically, democracy only really works in a high-trust, homogenous, culturally coherent civilization. If you demographically gerrymander a democracy because one side, mainly the native populations of the Anglosphere, vote along the lines of issues and policies and preoccupy themselves usually with things like economics, whereas the other side preoccupy themselves much more saliently with questions of collective identity, with race, with religion, with ethnic solidarity, and vote along the lines of redistributing resources via the state to themselves as a client group, then what you get is democracy building a critical mass of that second group until they become the majority and the issues-based individualistic native population become the minority. And in that scenario, I don't think that we would get the same protections as a minority as our supposedly liberal democratic governments are obsessed with affording to the various hostile client groups that have been brought into our country. And so you cannot have a democracy that is also culture blind and treats people like blank slates, because it was Wolfgang Buchenfurter, who was a jurist after the Second World War who was involved in reconfiguring Germany's constitution for obvious reasons. And he said the problem with liberal democracy is that it slowly undermines the givens upon which it rests, because it refuses to draw distinctions between people, culture, the nations that are brought into its borders, and instead enfranchise everyone in egalitarian fashion, even though they don't interact with democracy in the same way. And so the worrying feature of British life is that currently there are very few politicians who are brave enough to stand up and observe this fact and say there are certain cultures, and we'll get up onto the question of Islam that you raised at the start in a moment, certain cultures and religions which are incompatible with being British, despite in the last YouGov polling that found this out, 53% of people believe that being Muslim is incompatible with British values, mainly because there's never been a strong presence of Islam in Britain that contributed to the creation of Britain's peace and prosperity before recent decades, and it's already causing culture clashes. But when politicians put their head above a parapet and even in a mild fashion say these obvious truths like Katie Lamb or Robert Jenrick or Nick Timothy or Rupert Lowe, they're either banished from their party, piled on by the press, or denounced by their party leadership, despite this being obviously popular with the public. In terms of the conflation of religion and race, again, I think this is something that's very particular to the Anglosphere, and I think that we get it right, but we also have to have a theory of mind for how the rest of the world thinks of themselves. So I can very easily get along with Christians of other nationality and ethnic backgrounds. I can very easily get along on a civic way with highly educated Hindus or Sikhs who have been, very generous in this country in terms of their charitable giving. However, lots of other religions and faiths are much more tribal. This is why we saw in 2022 when a cricket match broke out between India and Pakistan, riots that shut down the city of Leicester for weeks. This is why we see Sikhs in Canada and even the UK now protesting on the streets for Khalistani independence, an entire Sikh nation, and lobbying the country that they themselves are now citizens of, whether it be Britain or Canada, for the interests of Indian politics. And this is why we see, in the worst example of this, in the Pakistani rape gangs that I've been covering for a while, this concept of asabaya. It's found in the Quran and Hadith, and it basically means extending loyalty only so far as what benefits you, your family, your broader clan network, your ethnicity, and your honor. Alfred Guillaume, who is a Arabist, who wrote a book just called Islam. It's a very good little tome for people to get a primer on Islam. He had a quote where he said, the Arab respects the laws of the land only insofar as it doesn't come between him and his own, as in only insofar as it doesn't interrupt that which interests his family. Whereas, of course, Christianity has the respect for the law of the land and then also the observance of your private faith, the render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, while also never knowing the hour or the day that you will be judged. There's a respect for civic authority and there's a respect for your religion. There is no separation of mosque and state. And we have to understand that there's also very little separation between Islam and ethnicity. And part of the reason is the high levels of cousin marriage practiced in these countries and also in the enclaves that are established in our countries. So Patrick Nash, who's an academic at Oxford, he writes for the Faros Institute, has written a long paper called The Case for Banning Cousin Marriage in Britain that I mentioned earlier. It's not banned, it's just not practiced by the host majority population, but it is practiced by Pakistani Biradiri clans in places like Bradford at rates up to 60%. And individualism, liberalism, the extension of moral consideration outside your ethnic in-group, your religion, your family, and yourself to other people is borderline impossible if you have such a closed-off community where you're marrying cousins all the time. And rates are very high in places like Iraq, Yemen, Syria, Afghanistan, Pakistan, etc. And so if we're importing people from that region of the world, we need to understand that they think collectively. And this is why in trials for the Pakistani rape gangs, you have had men convicted for raping, torturing, kidnapping children. And when the sentences have been read out, the daughters of the rapists who themselves have been abused shout out, "I love you, Dad." Yasmin Ali Harbi Brown wrote in the Mail in the 2010s, she herself is a Muslim woman and a leftist. She was interviewing Muslim women in these Muslim areas of the UK. And they said, yes, I was raped by my husband who is now in prison for raping white girls. And when she asked, well, what do you think about this? They said, well, have you seen how they dress? By Allah, it's immodest. Basically justifying the abuse of the girls because they're white and because they're not Muslim. The worst example was the head of the Ramadan Foundation in 2016. 3 of his cousins, and the actual rape gang networks are usually familiarly related as well because of the close-knit nature of these Pakistani communities. 3 of his cousins were sentenced for being part of a rape gang in Rotherham. And he wrote that the awful truth is that the Pakistani community know this is going on in Britain and have buried their heads in the sand because they, quote, don't want to be seen as siding with the white enemy. And so we have to understand that while we might separate religion and race, and that is the correct thing to do, lots of places around the world don't, and they don't share our moral system. And so we should augment our immigration system to reflect that.
So the way back, as you see it, English politics at the moment looks very badly broken. You touched on how the Conservatives, if you like, oversaw Brexit and Brexit was about control of the borders and Englishness, if you like, and so forth. And yet immigration and illegal immigration exploded. And now Keir Starmer has tried to reverse course, but he's not convincing the public at all. You've given us some astonishing numbers on immigration levels. That seems to be at the heart of what is now called the problem with all the major parties being a uni party. Are their days numbered, and what does it look like? What does it happen? Help us understand how you see it and where reform might come from.
So the Labour Party are in government, and they've gone from what Rupert Lowe calls a landslip loveless victory at the last election, where they got fewer votes than Jeremy Corbyn did in 2019, but a larger majority because the Conservative vote collapsed. They have gone from about 30% in the polls to 15%. They're now fourth in the polls. They're behind the Green, or they're equal with the Green Party. And the Green Party is now openly the party of Islamo-communism. It's led by Zach Polanski, a man who purposely changed his name to sound more Jewish, probably to give himself cover when he spreads, frankly, pro-Islamic, very conspicuously Israel-obsessed politics. And it's co-led by Mohsin Ali, who was a councillor who won in May of last year, is now deputy leader of the Green Party. And when he won, he shouted, Allahu Akbar, this is for Gaza. So nakedly sectarian politics are improving. They're increasing in the polls over Labour. Labour's support has collapsed because they've tried to serve all masters, be the umpires between the hostile multicultural communities they've imported and the left behind, forgotten, Indigenous British majority, who are now turning towards reform. The Conservative vote has collapsed for multiple reasons. One, because it's almost impossible to position yourself as the people who are credible to fix the problems that you caused after 14 years in government. The Conservatives consistently betrayed the country with successive leaders, other than Liz Truss, who they cooed out after 40 days to appease the financial markets, who themselves had horrifically mismanaged the debt and pension funds in this country. But the rest of the Conservatives leaders, Rishi Sunak, Boris Johnson, Theresa May, David Cameron, created a vast bureaucracy that entrenched multiculturalism as the politics of the day in Britain. They threw open the borders for mass migration, particularly to the third world after Brexit. Anytime there was an Islamic terror attack, the Home Office unit, RICU, that's the Research, Information and Communications unit, told the public, don't look back in anger, basically, don't blame us and the imported communities who disproportionately produce terrorists for this violence. And they've mismanaged the economy, they've waged net zero, they've sabotaged our energy security, they've depleted our armed forces down to the lowest level of reserves since the Napoleonic Wars, on and on and on and on. And so the Conservative Party has now collapsed. And rather than installing Robert Jenrick as leader, who's quite popular actually on social media, who is leading a renegade group of Conservatives like Katie Lamb and Nick Timothy to question the immigration orthodoxy of the last few years, to say we want to remove indefinite leave to remain, say we want mass deportations of all illegal immigrants, and we want to send lots of legal migrants that impose a cultural and economic cost on our country home. Rather than choose him, they chose Kemi Badenoch, who has parroted all of the tired liberal talking points in uninspiring fashion for the last few years, who had a lot of assistance getting to become a cabinet minister and become a sort of household name for repudiating the Black Lives Matter cultural revolution in 2020, but who has been unimpressive since elected leader, and is a first-generation immigrant who, in her speech in 2018, called for the removal of caps on student and study visas. And so in a time of immigration being the most salient issue in British politics, electing a first-generation immigrant leader who personally lobbied for more immigration is suicide, and I don't think she's going to stay there for very long if the Conservative Party are sensible. But I don't see how they're going to recover, and they're on the brink of like chopping up the furniture in the Carlton Club of firewood. Reform UK, the insurgent party led by Nigel Farage, are at 30-something% in the polls, and they have a once-in-a-generation mandate to destroy the Uniparty, to pry apart the two zombies of Labour and Conservatives that are leaning against each other and propping one another up, as Peter Hitchens once said. However, and I don't wish to be discouraging about reform, I've always considered myself a critical friend who has encouraged them to live up to their potential. They've got a few problems in that they've kicked out two of their MPs, Rupert Lowe and James McMurdoch, both of whom are pretty strong, actually. Rupert Lowe was the parliamentary workhorse and has been very popular again on social media. And they embroil themselves consistently in controversies, and they haven't yet learned that the media is their enemy. They haven't learned the Trump tactic that the media would rather see you fail or conform to their standards in such a degree that you are indistinguishable from Labour and the Conservatives. They still feel the need to play by the leftist handbook and appease the likes of the BBC and Sky News and LBC, etc. And so they make rhetorical concessions to the left over time. And even though some of their policies have become more encouraging, what I'd like to see is some stronger personnel. Now, they've just taken on board my friend, James Orr, who is a prominent speaker at ARC, try and cultivate some of that young talent. But at the moment, we've been speaking about this rightward shift among young men. Where's Reform's youth representation at all? I know someone who tried to start a Reform young people's chapter to try and do the kind of work that Charlie Kirk did on university campuses and with events. And they were told, no, it's too much of a liability. They're still afraid, basically, of young people using social media in a way that can't be controlled. And they just need to make peace with the fact that that's, as the Trump administration have, that's how politics is done now. They need substantive policies and they need better personnel if they're going to have a mandate to govern. Otherwise, they'll get through the door of Downing Street and they will be scuppered by the entrenched civil service bureaucracy that will say, well, actually, because of the laws on the books put there by Tony Blair, like the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act and the Constitutional Reform Act and the Human Rights Act, all of these international treaties and the mandate for civil service neutrality means the ministers just have to rubber stamp whatever civil servants put across their desk. What they need to do is on day one, have a plan to fire and rehire the entire civil service, and they need to repeal all of the laws that get in the way of doing that. And they need a massive Great Repeal Bill and a number of competent, loyal parliamentarians willing to use the stonking majority that Nigel Farage is poised to win to enact that agenda. I am not seeing the signs that they have got that as their agenda yet, but fortunately we still have possibly 4 years before the next election, though I would encourage them to act like the election may happen sooner than they think, because, as you said, John, with the growth of sectarian voting, with a pending economic collapse, with Labour's poll numbers going subterranean, I wouldn't be surprised if they called it early to cut their losses, and Reform needs to be prepared to govern tomorrow.
As you yourself have said, the bureaucracy may be more powerful now than the parliaments, than the politicians, and I think you've touched on this. A new political movement is faced with a massive problem of sorting through the maze of policy issues that would confront it, made infinitely more difficult to tackle because they'd have remarkably few people who actually understand how the machinery of government works. I know we can be cynical about politicians not using the levers properly, but the fact is that they're there and you've got to use them if you're to gain mastery and exercise authority on behalf of the people who put you there and to whom you're accountable. Public servants are not accountable. Elected members are. So can you, what should they be doing? What are they doing? What should they be doing? Because if they were to win government, there'd be very few of them that had any actual experience. That's problem number one. And problem number two is, what are they going to do, given they haven't got much experience, to regain those control over those levers of power? You had all sorts of people, groups working in America, providing the Republicans, whether one agrees with them or not, with a program and with mechanisms and approaches by which they could implement their policies. What is Britain doing? What's happening for reform in that regard?
So you've got lots of people talking publicly about this, like Liz Truss and David Starkey and Dominic Cummings, because they haven't been galvanized as a sort of brain trust yet in order to identify all of the malignant laws that have been laid down like railway tracks ever since, frankly, the post-war government to set Britain on a unidirectional path towards what Tony Blair clearly thought was an egalitarian utopia in the vein of John Lennon's Imagine, regardless of which government is elected to drive the train that given day. And so what Reform needs to do is a couple of things. First of all, they need to cultivate courage as well as understand the problem, because it's all well and good taking defectors from previous parties to give you an understanding of how the inner working of state actually functions. But if they were members of the failed political parties of the past, number one, you're going to look like a refugee camp or a retirement home for Tory politicians to the public who don't want Tory politicians. And two, if they were leading the previous government, then they were responsible for all of the problems, and so they weren't courageous enough to enact the solutions they're now proposing to you. You need actually quite a lot of fresh faces with nothing to lose quite a lot of these sort of young men that have staffed the Trump administration, frankly, the people I've spoken to in the likes of the State Department who are really getting things done, who go in with the mentality of you can just do things in order to push through this legislative agenda without any qualms. You need people with courage and conviction. Secondly, you do need a lot of CVs on file for that to happen. You're going to have to replace thousands of civil service. And one thing the Trump administration did, I know that Project 2025 was infamous, but one of the quieter things that was done was consulting places like the Claremont Institute and American Moment, different think tanks that gave young people placements and mentorship schemes in the Senate, in Congress, in various NGOs for a semester. And they kept those young people's CVs on file so that they knew they had politically aligned, competent, uncompromised people they could hire into the administration. And that's why things are basically running like clockwork. The third reason they're running so well is because Stephen Miller and the American First Policy Institute and various other policy bodies, like American Moment, came up with a suite of legal and policy reforms that they're now enacting as a sniper shot agenda. This is why Donald Trump had hundreds of executive orders to sign on day one, and it's why the core frustration is actually how slow and sclerotic Congress has been to cement Trump's agenda into legislation, despite them having a slim majority in the House and the Senate. What reform need to do is realize that if you regain parliamentary sovereignty by repealing the various laws that act like a Japanese knotweed strangling our national sovereignty, that you can basically just do anything. You're not like the separation of powers American system that ties everything up in judicial review in the Supreme Court, or holds it hostage to various conflicting moneyed interests in the Senate and Congress. Instead, if you are a party of government, you can just, if it's in the manifesto, you can just pass bills. The only way they can be thwarted is by two reasons. Number one, the House of Lords, they're meant to act as a stopgap on legislation. The House of Lords can only block things that are proposed that aren't in the manifesto, that aren't voted on by the public to be passed. And the problem that Reform has is it has no Lords. Despite being the popular party in the polls at the moment, they have only 5 MPs in the House of Commons, and they have no Lords that they're currently appointing. And so unless they put massive House of Lords reform in their manifesto, which would then allow them to reform the House of Lords before the Lords can block any bills, they're going to have a hard time getting anything that they want to do after being elected that they didn't promise before through the House of Lords, because Labour and Conservative Lords will just block it out of spite. And the other thing they need to do is repeal all of the laws that stop them from hiring and firing civil servants. At the moment, the cabinet secretary is the most powerful person in Britain. He basically tells what elected ministers should do. Great example of this is David Goodhart when he was having dinner with the cabinet secretary for Tony Blair and Gordon Brown at Oxford in 2010, a man named Gus O'Donnell, which they nicknamed God, obviously because of his initials, but because he was so powerful. He told him he was writing a book on the anywheres and somewheres divide, the people who are rooted in their country versus the transitory international business class who have global liberal values in mind. And Gus O'Donnell said, when I was at the Treasury, I lobbied for the most generous open borders immigration policy possible because I believed my commitment was to global welfare. And so this permanent civil servant that ministers can't fire, but he can fire ministers, is enacting open borders in an unelected bureaucracy against the wishes of the electorate. So what they need to do is they need to repeal the Constitutional Reform Act and get rid of the Supreme Court. They need to repeal the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act to get rid of civil service neutrality and the Civil Service Code being into law. They need to repeal the Human Rights Act to get rid of the European Convention on Human Rights. And they also need to leave or substantially reform the UN's 1951 Refugee Convention. They need to get rid of the Equality Act, which means that these civil servants will definitely sue for discrimination on the grounds of you breaking up their various identity interest groups within the civil service, like the LGBT network or the Home Office Islamic network, which, by the way, have had activists that have called Israel the Great Satan and actually pointed and laughed at ISIS recruitment videos in seminars, recognizing school friends as being active jihadists while calling counter-terror measures racist. These people shouldn't be working in our civil service. They need to get rid of all of these measures that block them enacting their legislative agenda, and they need to do it as soon as they come into government, because if you leave it, you will allow the civil service to become an organized minority that can cause institutional non-compliance, either by leaking to the press or just refusing to enact your agenda or tweaking bills and slipping it past inexperienced reform ministers who have the best of intentions, but don't have the experience, as you've said. So you need courage, you need conviction, you need competence, and you need a pre-drafted legislative agenda to hit the ground with on day one. So you don't become Trump term 1, you become much closer than Trump term 2.
A++, I would have thought, for your response. You're obviously very aware of just how great this challenge is going to be. I think I'm right in saying that you've actually said that remigration may be the defining issue of the next British election. What did you mean by remigration? Is it realistic? And what would you say to those who said, you've touched on this, who'd say that's racist, it's inhumane, it's illiberal?
So it is illiberal, but yet again, given the foundational myth of liberalism is the blank slate, and that's just obviously wrong, I'm fine with being a liberal. I think we need to be a liberal. I think what people mistake for liberalism is actually just how the English have done politics for many years, which seems second nature to us in the Anglosphere. But when you extend this around the world in, the constitution of Liberia or South Africa, or you try to bomb Iraq into democracy, it turns out that other people, other faiths, other cultures don't think the way we do. So we actually do need to be a liberal. Otherwise, we're fighting with one hand behind our back against barbarism that we have imported. As far as remigration, I didn't used to use the term because the term was the preoccupation of some people with some odious and unjust beliefs. There are some people out there who would see it fit to treat someone like Raja Mia, for example, who is a former councillor in Oldham who has been an advocate for the grooming gang survivors, as no different than one of the Pakistani rape gang perpetrators purely because he has Pakistani heritage. I think that's incorrect. Utterly immoral. However, I also think it's completely incorrect to say if you arrive yesterday and you sign up to the Scouts Pledge of British Values, you're as British as you and me and you can never leave. What we need to do instead is embark on a series of policy changes that will ensure or encourage lots of people who are not compatible with our civilization to return to the countries that actually better suit the way they want to see things governed. So we need to deport all illegal immigrants that are in our country already. The estimate as early as 2017 was 1.2 million, and that was before the Boris wave. That was before they stopped estimating the number of legal migrants in the country in 2021. So we've got well over 2 million in our country anyway. This was before also the small boats crisis. We need to deport every single foreign criminal currently in our prisons and foreign offenders, because every single crime committed by a foreign national never needed to happen. It was a consequence of a policy decision to bring the criminal into the country to ruin a life. And so if they were brought here by policy decisions, they could be removed by policy decisions. Then we should be a liberal regarding to cultural distinctions. So we should be banning the burqa, we should be banning halal slaughter, we should not be funding any mosques or madrasas. Frankly, we should be very clear about which religions are and aren't compatible with our civilization. And I would say, given the history of Jews in the country, given that King Alfred the Great wrote his Doom book according to the years of the life of Moses and the Ten Commandments, there might be a friendly accord that we can come to with the Jewish communities that settled in Britain over the number of years. However, Britain is a Christian country. It needs to be a predominantly Christian country. And so people exist outside of those parameters in the boundaries of who has good relationships with the host nation. And so if communities have good relationships with the host majority, with the host nation, they can stay. If they are hostile to, incompatible with our state religion, our culture, don't like our people very much, then they should either be encouraged to leave, or if they commit a crime, they should be deported. And the way we can encourage people to leave is remove their benefits and make it impossible to basically live in these hostile sectarian enclaves, the kinds of communities that have harbored the Pakistani rape gangs, even though they didn't participate in themselves. We should make it impossible for you to live like that in our country. Because I happen to think that all immigration policy should be done along the lines of what politics is done. The phrase has been bandied around by the contentious jurist Carl Schmitt from the 30s, where basically politics boils down to friend and enemy. The group that agrees with your existential vision of the good life, that wants to see you happy and thriving, that might disagree with things like marginal tax rates, but ultimately doesn't want to shoot you dead like Charlie Kirk for having a conversation, and the group that poses an existential threat to your way of life. Communists, Muslim revolutionaries, people who would shoot you dead for a conversation. And I think immigration policy should account for that. We should allow our friends to stay, the people who have married into our civilization, who raise their children, who are half British of this land, like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, for example. But the people who will not recreate our civilization, the people that don't like our people, our culture, our history, our religion very much, the people that impose costs and crimes on our population should leave. And frankly, the first group, the friendly minorities that are members of our families and friendship networks, are a very small group. And that means we can accommodate those people because immigration is not just a matter of culture, but it's also a matter of numbers and pressure on public services. The much larger group is people who live apart from us, who practice completely alien customs, and who receive large amounts of state benefits. 47% of social housing in London goes for people of foreign descent. 72% of Somalians live in social housing in Britain. Why am I paying money from my taxes to battery farm Somalians in my country? About 20% odd of them are also in prisons. That means almost all Somalians living in Britain are living in state-subsidised housing. I think it's only Ayan who isn't at this point. People like that just shouldn't be here. It's a complete option for them to be here. They have another country to be in where they will practice out of habit the conditions of their home, and that's fine. They can go over there.
I don't think any of us saw the depopulation bomb, as some demographers are now calling it, that's headed our way. So to some extent, high immigration will be justified by many economists who will say collapsing birth rates in the West, and not only in the West. You could say the same of Japan, which, despite being the most homogenous society on earth, is now starting to say, well, we need immigrants to come in because our aging population means we just don't have the workers to keep the economy going and to pay the taxes. How do we balance that one out? You've touched on it. Who's having children? And might it be that somehow or other, against all expectations, birth rates might recover? Because that's an important factor in this whole debate.
Yeah, so in Britain, 40% of children are born to a family where at least one parent was not born in Britain. So that's not accounting for ethnic breakdowns, it's just accounting for whether or not they are a first-generation immigrant. And so you're getting a revolving door of demography, which then means you're going to get a cultural churn as well, because it's a lot harder to instill a love of a foreign culture in a foreign population than it is to encourage or even revive a forgotten culture in a settled population. The bar for integration is basically the biblical character Ruth, where you need to renounce your prior people and your prior religion and say, your people are my people, your God is my God. Very few people fit that mold. In terms of demography, Britain's birth rate is something like 1.5 now, and it's much more pronounced among immigrant groups, subsidized by immigrant groups, than it is among the native population. The likes of Stephen Shaw and Paul Morland have done excellent work on this, where they show that you can provide marginal economic incentives, as they have in Hungary, for example, by giving tax breaks to women who have up to 4 children. You'll never pay income tax again. By giving loans to women who have multiple children, you can provide economic incentives that do boost the birth rate a little bit. Marriages have doubled, the divorces and abortions have plummeted, and the birth rate has gone up by 0.2. And it's the only European country where that happened. And it happened during COVID lockdowns as well, which is quite an achievement, but it's still only 0.2. So we need to watch that experiment play out. What you need not just is economic transformation, but cultural transformation. And cultural transformation will not come by replacing your population with people who do not share that culture. I think this is why the Japanese have just voted for, well, their parliament has voted for the new prime minister, Takaichi, because she has promised not just to reduce the number of foreign nationals who are coming into the country for mercantile reasons. There was a deal signed by the previous prime minister that saw 500,000 Indians are set to come into Japan by 2030, and only 50,000 of them are skilled. Why does Japan need 450,000 Indian peasants? To what economic or cultural benefit is that of Japan? I think Takaichi is reassessing this, but she also said, we're going to deport gaijin, foreigners, on the grounds that they are disrespectful to our culture. And that is what I think matters more, John. I think we can undergo periods of economic hardship, as we did in the 70s, as Hungary did under the Soviet Union, as we are doing now, because the same economists that say we need mass migration in order to subsidize falling birth rates and pay for pensions are the same economists that thought that running a debt-based economy would work just great for a while and run Keynesian economics to control inflation by printing more money or increasing interest rates is a sensible way to do things. I won't listen to those economists, I don't think, because they can't balance a budget. Problem number one. But I think we can recover from economic hardship if we are the same people. We can recover from cultural amnesia if we are the same people. This is why the Great Revival is happening mainly among young, native white British, American, Australian, etc. men. But we can't recover if we're no longer the same people, because you don't have cultural amnesia. Instead, you're just going to recreate foreign culture in our country out of habit. And so, no matter the issue that we're facing, whether it's economic, whether it's a cultural malaise, whether it's demographic decline, subsidizing our falling birth rates with other countries who, by the way, including India now, are sub-replacement themselves, isn't sustainable, it's not desirable, and it won't reproduce our civilization at the end of it. Instead, what we need is a cultural change. And I'll finish on this, if I may. I visited Israel for the first time this year. Now, I am not Jewish, either ethnically or religiously. I see it very curious that this small strip of land preoccupies our political debate so much. But when I visited, I understood that they have a working model of national identity. They have. It would be inconceivable for Israel to be not led by a Jewish person acting in the interests of Jews. It was founded in the 40s, not even by a religious Jew, by David Ben-Gurion, but who wrote it, the constitution, established a state as a protection for the Jewish people, a distinct ethnic and cultural group. And they, despite being besieged from all sides by terrorist adversaries, despite their long memory of expulsions and persecution, they have a high birth rate and an above replacement birth rate among secular Jews. And part of the reason that Paul Morland, who is a practicing Jew, explained to me is this: the cultural premium placed on having families is high. And what you need to have then is a cognizance that you are contributing to your civilization, that you need to pay it forward, that you have an extended network of families around you that can also care for your children, and that the economy is set up in such a way that doesn't cannibalize your entire personal and private life for the sake of the market. This is actually, I think, a problem that Japan are having right now. Far too many young people are spending their entire lives at work or socializing with people at work, and so are having fewer marriages, fewer long-term relationships, and are not having children within those marriages because the out-of-wedlock birth rate is very low in Japan. What we need is a economic reassessment and a cultural rejuvenation rather than mass migration to fix our demographic decline. And that's how we'll restore not just the peace and prosperity of our own countries again, but we'll remain a cohesive people. And we will be, as George Orwell observed in Lion and the Unicorn, the same civilization observably if you brought someone 100 years to the past to now. Because I think lots of people who fought and died in the Second World War, if transported to London today, would be just like you, John. They would be appalled at the state of it and wondering what they'd fought for.
You've been very generous with your time. You're painting a picture of quite an uprising, if I can put it that way, but a good one, a valuable one, seeking to recapture Britain. Are you optimistic or pessimistic? Is Professor David Betts' thesis that England may be heading towards civil war something that worries you, or do you think this can be turned around in the sort of classic understated British way, quiet determination, strong leadership, high-quality debate, leading to good quality policy?
Well, hope, not optimism, is a Catholic virtue, John. So I'd say I'm hopeful, not optimistic. As far as David Betts' prediction, Dominic Cummings and Colonel Richard Kemp, who I've interviewed on my YouTube channel, have all said the same thing. And they've come to this conclusion independently of reading one another's work, which is quite alarming. And that is that if you turn up the temperature on ethnically heterogeneous sectarian societies, you get the kinds of guerrilla warfare that we saw during the Troubles in Ireland or in Lebanon. And I think you're seeing that with that video from the last weekend where the Islamo-leftist alliance is breaking down because third world thugs are demanding jihad and a caliphate, whereas the leftists who have allowed them in just wanted John Lennon's Imagine and thought naively they could live in peace and not be persecuted. So I am worried that if the government continues to import hostile tribal minorities, allow them to establish ethnic enclaves, and subject them to preferential treatment under hate speech laws, lenient sentencing, and the other suite of unjust laws per two-tier policing and two-tier justice, that we will see factionalism along mainly ethnic but also religious lines between the indigenous host majority and tribal minorities. And the main thing that concerns me is that a little while ago for Courage Media, I was reporting a piece of information that I got from someone who relayed some intelligence community chatter. Various foreign intelligence agencies have warned the British government consistently now for a number of years that 30,000 named jihadists, as well as the 40,000 jihadists that are on MI5's terror watch list currently, reside in our country and are planning some sort of vigilante jihadist attack. This happened recently, for example, when ISIS, just a few weeks ago, had said its followers across the West should use trucks and knives and guns to commit jihadist attacks. And then we saw a man named Jihad murdering Jews at a synagogue on Yom Kippur in Manchester. But the intelligence agencies have warned Britain that this attack is coming. They're going to attack critical infrastructure. They'll commit arson against houses. There'll be mass chaos in the streets if thousands of these violent jihadists commit these attacks. And then you have a sympathetic population who, for example, don't think Hamas committed murder and rape on October 7th, who've been demonstrating every weekend in favor of Hamas since October the 7th, since the morning after they were praying outside in Downing Street. You will get some sort of violent uprising if you don't curb this. And the British government have ignored these warnings to the extent where now Israel has stopped sharing intelligence with the UK government because, one, has recognized a fictitious state of Palestine, but two, because there are so many jihadist activists embedded in the Home Office and in the intelligence agencies thanks to DEI legislation. They're going to need to be removed by the next government. So, am I worried about it? Definitely. Is the government making the problem worse? Yes, for either multicultural liberal or purely craven electoral calculation reasons. Can it be fixed? Yet again, returning to the previous answer about reform, you need a mandate to govern. You need the courage to govern. You need the personnel capable of enacting this agenda. And so what reform you need to do now is basically what President Trump did in his second term. They need to be magnanimous. They need to coalesce all of the talent, which is crackling like ambient electricity in the air. They need to act as a lightning rod for that talent to strike, especially young right-wing talent who are very well-informed and capable and willing to lead the charge on these things. And then when they get into government, which it looks 4 years out from an election, possibly, they're definitely going to, with a massive majority, and an unquestionable majority, they need to govern as if this is the last election, as if they only have the next 5 years to save the country. Because judging by demographics, judging by culture, judging by the looming threat of jihadist violence in my country, I really think this is our only shot.
Well, you've given us a very great deal to think about, and you've backgrounded us with a lot of very precise arguments. So thank you very much indeed for your time, and I wish you well.
Likewise, John. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you at ARC next year.